welcome back to another episode of Write, Publish, Connect. My name is Alexa Nazaro, and I am the founder of the Axel Author Group. Today, I'm going to be talking everything memoir with a wonderful guest who has a lot of information and insight on the topic. Natalie Silver, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me, Alexa.
So Natalie is a book coach, editor, and writer who's worked in the publishing space for 2 decades. She operates Silver Scribe Editorial Services, where she specializes in nonfiction, hence the memoir theme. She specializes in nonfiction, including trade, self-published books, academic journals, dissertations, and even project management within the publishing industry. So as we see, she's got a nice breadth of experience. But today we're focusing on memoir. So I work with plenty of authors, and memoir seems to be a really popular genre, at least in my experience. Do you find the same thing in the indie author world? Do you find memoir is popular?
I think memoirs are increasingly popular. I majored in creative nonfiction in college, and it was sort of an emerging field at that time, about 25 years ago. And I think since then it has really taken off. I think with the popularity of self-publishing, being able to write and get your memoir out there is more and more accessible. So I think I love reading memoirs and I love people telling their stories. So I think it's a really positive thing.
Now you have a workbook, and it is a workbook. It's not just one of these fluffy how-tos on writing and publishing a memoir. Give us a bit of an overview of that.
Yeah, sure. I self-published a workbook called Write and Self-Publish Your Memoir. It's now available on Amazon if you want to purchase it. And I wanted to give authors a step-by-step guide of preparing to write a memoir. So this includes all the information to decide why you want to publish a memoir, the tools that you might need to publish a memoir, what your memoir may contain. It distinguishes between the genre of memoir and life story, which are two different things. So a memoir is a story that's centered around a theme or a time and place in your life. And it usually has a story arc where you grow through the memoir. A life story is what you'd kind of think of as more of a traditional autobiography, and it's usually chronological, and it will detail the parts of your life from birth to where you are right now. So I wanted to give people information about these different options of writing so then they can decide to make the process easier.
So in the reflection phase, what are some questions an author should ask themselves before even deciding to jump into writing a memoir in terms of, is this right for me? What are there like two questions writers should ask themselves?
I absolutely think so. I think the most important one is to think of your motivation and your audience. So, people might be telling you should write a memoir, or you might feel like you should write a memoir, but unless you've defined the why you're going to do it and the who you're going to do it for, it's going to be very difficult to go through the, many month or years process of getting that book written.
What are some memoirs? What are some of your favorite memoirs? I love reading memoirs. Are there some favorites that you would point at authors to in terms of getting inspiration?
Absolutely. I probably read 10 to 20 memoirs a year. My workbook lists several, including, I'm sorry, I wrote them down just in case I forget. I think there's some great ones about careers. Like I feel like Shoe Dog by Phil Knight was a great one about a career.
Yes,
I think
that was a great one.
a lot of people want to write about their careers and share that, and the audience could be their colleagues or their family and kind of show their growth in their career. I also really like the Born a Crime by Trevor Noah.
Yes.
He's a humorist and he's obviously very talented, but I thought, in terms of memoir, that was really interesting in what he captured about his childhood. And I learned so much about him and the South African culture in the process.
Mhm.
I also love Kelly Corrigan's writing. She kind of touches the heartstrings and talks a lot about growing up and what she's learned. And one of hers is called Glitter and Glue. And it talks about when she moved to Australia to be an au pair, and it's a coming of age memoir. And
Nice.
then recently I just read Amy Martin's new memoir called The Tell, which I think is going to be a very buzzy summer read and is fascinating. And then I also really enjoyed Viola Davis's memoir about her rise to fame and her hard childhood.
Okay, very cool. So when planning to write a memoir, so an author has decided, okay, I've identified my audience, let's say, or I know the why. What are some key steps in planning the memoir?
I think that so that was one of the reasons that I wrote the workbook, because I do think you can break it down step by step so it's not so overwhelming. I think identifying the why will make the writing a lot easier. Brainstorming different pieces of the memoir or the life story would be helpful, and then you can kind of outline it and fill it in with scenes and memories, and then you can kind of chunk it out for the writing process. I
Mhm.
think that can be very useful. I also think hiring a book coach or an editor to kind of talk through it can be really helpful, or finding a writing group to share your writing with as you create the story can also propel you forward.
One of the tricky things about memoir, especially if it's a deeply personal one, is at some point someone in your life has misbehaved, right? And I know sometimes authors will ask me, oh, I don't know. Do I want to put this person in my memoir, even though it is a critical element in the story? And sometimes that decision can have like major repercussions. I mean, I know an author who really got some pretty bad backlash for her decision to include certain people. So what is your take on that, Natalie? If someone says, I have to write about my childhood, but there was someone in the family that I just have to mention.
Yeah, so this is complicated. And I will just preface this by saying I am not a very confrontational person. So I often struggle to help advise on this for people because it's not my natural tendency to want to lay all of that out, but that's a personal preference. I don't discourage authors from doing that. But I would caution an author from going too far, and I would ask them to look introspectively of the motivation to really lay it out there about a negative experience and specifically naming that person. Because one thing that I've read over and over in books by amazing authors who've given us their perspective on writing is that creating a memoir should not be a therapeutic process. If you need to go seek therapy, you should do that and not tell it in your memoir. Now, that being said, I don't want to discourage people from writing about difficult topics. You know, if you really feel the strong need to include that person in specific instances and you are concerned about libel, I would consult with a lawyer or a publishing expert on that topic. And then the other thing that I would encourage is that everyone encounters difficult situations and difficult people that would be important in a memoir. And one aspect of memoir that is different than life story is that you can be a little bit more creative in how you introduce those characters, because memoir is actually considered creative nonfiction. So you can have a person, a different name of a person, different characteristics of a person. You can have one kind of almost fictional person represent a group of people. You're allowed to do that in memoir. And people reading memoir should understand that this is your version of the story. Now, obviously, there's a fine line between your your nonfiction experience in creating a novel or a fictional piece. So that would be something that you would need to consider when you're marketing the book. But I would just caution people from writing a book solely to burn someone down. I feel like there might be other motivations and other outlets to process that information.
That is so well said. Very, very well said. What about word count? Sometimes when I talk to authors, they're kind of fixated on word count. If it's too few words, it just doesn't feel to them like a substantial book. Do you have guidelines, or are you just one of those, just write what you have to write?
I have a lot of feelings about this. I read a lot of books and I actually prefer shorter books, especially memoirs. Sometimes I feel like when you are trying to hit that maybe 350, 400 page count, it can just get too long for the reader. I find a lot of memoirs are very effectively told between 40 and 60,000 words. Now, that being said, I've worked with authors recently and we've had 70,000 and even 100,000 word counts. So I think it's sometimes how the story unfolds and what needs to go into the story. But I would encourage someone who's especially going to self publish and they are just keen to have their story out there to move beyond the word count hang up and just write their story. Even if it's 20,000 or 25,000 words, it's still an accomplished project that's meeting your goal of sharing your story.
Have you ever encountered a memoir author whose story is so vast that they feel that packing it all into one book just isn't appropriate and they'd rather cut it up, if you will, into a series?
I actually have encountered this with an author just recently, and we were trying to break down his motivations. So he had done a lot of academic work, he'd had a big career, and he also had a very interesting life story about immigrating from another country. And the where we settled is we decided to incorporate his childhood and career into one book, and then to lay out other ideas that may be more policy driven, that might be a little bit more of a nonfiction book, and put that into a later pile.
Okay. All right. And when an author is working on their memoir and they have so many examples, let's say, of a theme or so many scenarios or anecdotes, what kind of editing tips would you have in terms of, oh boy, maybe I have too many of
Yeah.
this type?
So I tell my clients, whether they're writing memoir or they're writing nonfiction, and this may go against the grain of other editors' advice, but I think as a reader of books, I like predictability. So I would encourage people to sort of pick a number of scenes that they would like to represent for each maybe aspect of the story or each chapter, and get comfortable with the idea of delivering that same amount of information in each section of the book. So I think that that might be a way to decide what's important and not important.
Okay. You talk quite a bit about brainstorming in your workbook. What are some of your favorite brainstorming techniques for authors?
Well, I am a huge journaler, so I always advocate for just writing out the thoughts, kind of doing brain dumps as you go through the process. I also think, typing stuff out in notes can be helpful on the computer. Taking walks and just maybe giving yourself time to think about a specific topic could be helpful. I mean, we all know we have our best ideas in the shower. So, like, I would just, keep yourself open minded to letting the ideas come as they arrive, and making sure that you have a pen and paper or your typing device handy so you can jot those ideas down.
What about a title for a memoir? Do you have a particular approach? When I work with authors in any kind of nonfiction, really, I always encourage them to go for that kind of short, punchier title. So, i.e., Born a Crime, right? Instead of Chronicle of My Childhood in South Africa. So something punchy. And then if they want a subtitle that has more, that really gives more concrete information on what the memoir is about. What advice is that kind of your approach, or do you have a different philosophy?
I think your philosophy is awesome. And one thing that I will always tell a client is that I am not an expert in marketing. And I definitely think a title is a place where talking to a marketing expert can be beneficial. Now, that being said, I think that it's important that the subtitle be descriptive, and that the too much language doesn't get put into the actual title. I completely agree with you. And interestingly enough, I'm not very AI savvy yet. I'm not resistant, but I haven't dipped my toes too much into it. But I just had two clients use ChatGPT to give them ideas for the title, and I actually thought that was a great idea. They got a big list and they were able to really consider those ideas, and then they didn't pick one of those, but they refined the ideas that ChatGPT spit out and came up with something they really liked.
Yeah, they massaged it. What would you say are a couple of the worst mistakes memoir authors can commit when they decide to undertake this journey?
I really try to be a cheerleader to my clients, and I really believe in the idea that done is better than good. So I would just encourage anyone who is interested in writing a memoir to actually sit down, plan it out, and get it done. You will never regret having that document and going through that process. So I would just, when people come to me, one of the reasons I wrote this workbook is I just think that if you have a plan and you give yourself a schedule, you will get it done, especially if you hire somebody to also encourage you along the way.
In your experience, how many drafts? Like, I know that that's a question that all writers seem to love, especially perhaps writers earlier in their careers. They like to know, well, how many drafts before I know it's done? What advice do you give to authors for that? Because sort of, perfect is the enemy of done, or good is the enemy of done. So what would you say?
I think you need to have several drafts. I think, we all know Anne Lamott and her, expletive first drafts idea that you just need to kind of get out the bad one first and then you refine. As I've worked with authors over the years, we definitely start with that, very rough draft. And then usually, as in publishing, you would maybe go through a developmental edit and then you would go through maybe a line edit before you get to a polished draft. And I always encourage clients to be patient and give a lot of time to this process because, as you know, as well as I do, writing a book is a huge endeavor and it's going to take a lot of time. And if you rush it, it's like I said, it's important to have it done, but it's still going to take time.
Absolutely. And in terms of marketing, so I know you said that this was not necessarily your necessarily major area of expertise, but you do have some insight in terms of marketing a memoir. How would you say that's different than marketing genre fiction, for example?
Oh, this is one I haven't considered yet. Obviously, a memoir is very personal. And so the way that you cultivate your audience might be different than something that is more about your profession or about a hobby or an interest. So I would tell people to consult someone like you to give them ideas. I think having a blog and sharing your story and connecting with other people is really important. I think being comfortable to own your story and be able to share it in a condensed and meaningful way will help the story have legs. As you would probably recommend, cultivating a newsletter or an audience before publishing is very important. And if you're writing a memoir, you're going to have to do a lot of the legwork for the marketing because there's maybe not a natural industry or association you can connect with if you were, say writing something that was more centered on your career or a specific topic.
And something that I think is worth mentioning too is sometimes I've worked with certain memoir authors who really it's just about telling their story, and whoever happens to pick it up picks it up. So, some memoir authors, and it's completely valid to do this, is they just want to get their story out. Maybe they have some family members who have always wanted to know about their grandmother's childhood or whatever the case might be. So sometimes that alone can be a mission without this huge complex marketing plan.
I completely agree. And I will just share a few stories about that. I have one client who kind of spurred me to develop my book coaching business and write this workbook after we worked together, who got his story out and had so many thankful family members express their appreciation for the story because he was actually connected to a larger immigrant group and they just really enjoyed having that resource. And then I do have a client who he and I worked together for book coaching, and then he went off and wrote the book himself. And he actually just passed away. And knowing that he put his story out there for his family really made my heart feel so good when it was, I learned of his tragic passing because I know that those stories will live on.
Very much so. And what parting words of advice would you give to memoir authors? Let's say the ones who are slogging through their first draft.
I would say don't get overwhelmed. Come up with smaller micro goals for the writing process. Give yourself time and space to write and also plenty of breaks. Maybe put an end date on the calendar where you would like to have that draft finished and work backward and figure out how much writing you need to do on a monthly or weekly basis to achieve that goal. And then don't be afraid to reach out to an expert in publishing to connect with them to kind of give you perspective on the process.
Great advice. Thank you so much, Natalie, for imparting your insight. I'm sure it'll be of great value to a lot of authors. Again, memoir just seems to be a very, very popular genre, and people who undertake it, they're really passionate about their story. So thank you so much.
Thank you for having me, Alexa. I really appreciate it.
All right. Have a great day.
Thank you.